Sometimes what saves a man isn't a witness, it's a lesson in physics. In Las Vegas, a used car dealer drowning in debt got into a car and stepped out of it a murder suspect. Nobody believed him. There wasn't any evidence, or so everyone thought. Have you ever wondered where a spent shell casing actually lands? In this case, that casing saved a man's life. Courtroom C, on the 8th floor of the Clark County Courthouse, wasn't anything special, really. The carpet had carried the same gray stain for years. The air conditioning rattled a bit too loudly. But that Tuesday morning, the hallway was busier than usual. A handful of reporters, a few curious neighbors, and in the corner, a woman who wasn't talking to anyone, turning a set of rosary beads over and over in her hand. The security officer at the entrance gave the same tired morning to everyone passing through the metal detector. For him, it was just another ordinary Tuesday, same as any other. He'd later tell a reporter that nothing about that morning had felt any different. Just another case, he said. At least, that's what I thought. That woman was Lisa Carver. She'd shown up to every hearing for 3 months to watch her husband's case unfold. Today was no different. She walked in, took her usual seat, 3rd row from the back, because the first 2 rows had been claimed by reporters at an earlier session, and honestly, that still bothered her. The man at the defense table was 44, a little heavyset, wearing a navy suit that didn't quite fit, like he'd borrowed it. Nathan Carver kept turning his wedding band around his finger, a habit, or maybe just the restlessness of not knowing where else to put his hands. Before he was charged with murder 3 months earlier, he had never once set foot inside a courtroom. Everyone stood. Judge Miriam Cho walked in, cropped hair somewhere between silver and black, rectangular glasses, and the flat, almost bored composure that 20 years on the bench gives a person. She opened the file. The State of Nevada versus Nathan Carver, the clerk read. Case number 24C33871. The air in the room shifted. Just like that, Prosecutor Gerald Finch rose. Silver mustache, pinstripe suit, the kind of ease that comes from 30 years of talking in this exact room. He read the charge. 2nd-degree murder. Your Honor, he said, his voice oddly calm for a subject this grim. The defendant shot the victim in the head, out in an isolated stretch of land. The evidence is clear. Rachel Ostrander rose, red-framed glasses, hair pulled tight, carrying the confidence of someone who'd read the file 3 times over. Not guilty, Your Honor, she said. She didn't make a speech. She just added, my client didn't fire that gun. We're going to prove it, not because we say so, but because the evidence does. In the back rows sat a gray-haired man with a gold watch, Victor Sabo. He was the prosecution's key witness. He'd actually been arrested himself, at first, before being released. Now here he was, on the other side of the case, sitting with a calm expression, as if none of this had anything to do with him. Before Finch finished speaking, one small detail caught the eye. Victor wasn't holding a file. He was holding a coffee cup, sitting comfortably. When a man is dead, a witness being this relaxed was something a few observers in the gallery noticed within the very first minutes. Nathan Carver had been selling used cars for 12 years. Business was good, actually really good, but there's a mistake a lot of successful small business owners in Vegas make, thinking bigger. In 2022, he moved into second-hand luxury vehicles. It ran on post-dated checks. You'd sell a car today, get paid 6 months later, and count the difference as profit. Sounds easy enough, right? Sell a car for 80 grand, collect 85 in 6 months. Nice. But when a check bounces, you're on the hook for the full 80,000 up front, and nobody in that business ever gives up the assumption that a check will clear. Until, one day, somebody does. That's how Nathan's business fell apart. 3 big checks bounced in 1 year. He was too late for a bank loan, and his credit was already shot. Out of desperation, on a friend's recommendation, he went to a private lender, Victor Sabo. The first time, he borrowed 40,000. A month later, another 50. Even years later, Nathan remembered that first meeting. It happened at a coffee shop, in the tone of an ordinary conversation. Victor had been smiling that day, had even paid for the coffee himself. "Just between us," he'd said, "this kind of thing moves a lot faster than a bank ever could." At the time, that had sounded perfectly reasonable to Nathan. He would only understand, much later, just how calm a face danger could wear. In total, he borrowed $130,000. When it came time to pay, the interest rates were higher than any bank would ever dare offer. Within a year, Nathan had paid back nearly double what he'd borrowed, $240,000. But Victor wouldn't let up. There was always some excuse. The exchange rate had shifted, land prices had gone up, gold was up again. Victor wasn't just calling anymore. He was showing up at the shop, yelling in front of customers. One time, Nathan's 16-year-old son was there. Victor insulted his father right in front of the kid. When Nathan pushed back, Victor just laughed. "Who do you think you are, talking back to me?" he said. "I go through 10 guys like you for breakfast." The dealership's sales associate, Frank Bellamy, witnessed most of it, and later confirmed it in court. Whenever Mr. Sabi showed up, Bellamy said, Nathan's hands would start shaking, just his. Never happened with any other customer. That small observation would matter more later on. At one point, Nathan considered going to the police, but Victor seemed to have anticipated that already. "If you go to the cops," he'd said, "it won't be you who pays, it'll be your family." That threat existed nowhere on paper, no recording, just in Nathan's memory and in the worried conversations he'd had with his wife. On a Thursday in October, Victor came to the shop, this time not alone. With him was his younger cousin, Adam Sabo, 28, also in the private lending business, still green but trying hard to be just as ruthless as his older cousin. "We're going somewhere," Victor said. "We're going to talk." Nathan felt his heart pick up speed, but there was nowhere left to run. At this stage of the trial, the defense called a forensic accountant, Diane Kessler, 18 years of experience tracking debt flows. She took the stand with a presentation full of colorful charts. "I reviewed Mr. Carver's bank records," she said. Over 18 months, a total of $240,000 was transferred directly into Victor Sabo's accounts. Kessler projected a timeline onto the screen. The original debt was $130,000. Payments came in regularly, but after each payment, the debt didn't actually shrink. Sometimes it grew instead. "This," Kessler said, "is a classic loan sharking pattern. The principal never really closes out, because the interest gets recalculated after every payment, sometimes even retroactively." Finch objected. "Your Honor, this financial analysis has no direct bearing on the murder." Ostrander answered, "Your Honor, this explains why my client got into that car in the first place. Without understanding the motive, we can't understand the full picture of what happened." Judge Cho overruled the objection. The records would remain before the court. Those numbers gave concrete shape, in the room, to a cold reality. Nathan was a man with nowhere left to run. On paper, he had paid off his debt, and then some, but the system itself never once said, "We're done." Behind him getting into that car with 2 other men lay months of accumulated desperation. Before stepping down, Kessler added one more thing. "I also reviewed Mr. Sabo's bank records, by the way, with the court's permission. During that same period, he received similar transfers from at least 4 other small business owners. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a business model." With that final sentence, the room realized this case was in truth just a small piece of a much larger pattern. The 3 of them got in a car. Victor took the driver's seat. Adam sat up front, passenger side. Nathan sat in the back, directly behind Victor, not by any particular choice, just where he happened to sit without thinking about it. The car drove out of the city, toward an isolated stretch of desert. Nobody said much along the way. They pulled over. Victor started talking, not calmly, straight into insults. He cursed Nathan's wife, his mother, everything about him, demanded another $100,000. Nathan said he didn't have it. Victor didn't laugh this time. "Then you know what I'm going to take instead," he said. What exactly happened isn't entirely clear. There's no recording, no camera, Just 3 people, 2 of them still alive to tell it. An argument, a hand moving, a gun, and then 1 hand fired. Adam Sabo was shot in the left temple. He died a few minutes later. And this is exactly where the story splits in 2. According to Victor, Nathan pulled the gun and shot Adam. According to Nathan, the gun was in Victor's hand, and it went off during a struggle. Both stories were possible. Neither one, on its own, was convincing enough. All that was left was the evidence. When Victor took the stand, he didn't hesitate for a second. Nathan pulled his gun, he said, his voice flat and smooth, pointed it at Adam. I tried to stop it, but I was too late. Finch asked a few more questions, and Victor had a ready answer for each one, like he'd rehearsed this story in front of a mirror more than once. When Ostrander began cross-examination, her first few questions were almost routine. Was the gun in Adam's possession or yours? I don't know, Victor said. Can you walk us through exactly what happened in that moment? Victor shrugged. It all happened really fast. He pulled it, he shot. That's it, that's it. That phrase would become one of the defense's most repeated lines in the days to come. Because when a person watches a killing happen right in front of them, they usually remember a lot more detail than that. But every time, Victor's account kept collapsing back into the same 3 sentences. The room wasn't yet sure what to make of that. Maybe Victor really was in shock. Maybe he didn't remember because he didn't want to. Or maybe there wasn't much more to tell because the story, from the very start, wasn't quite true. One juror would say, in a post-trial interview, Victor didn't talk like someone who was scared. He didn't talk like someone grieving a lost relative either. He just talked like someone who'd rehearsed it. Like he'd memorized the lines, but forgotten the feeling. That observation never made it into the record, but it summed up the mood in the room. Rachel Ostrander took over Nathan's case in its 3rd month. She remembered that first visit clearly. A small, cold interview room, a plastic chair, and across from her, a crying man. I didn't do it, Nathan said, over and over. His voice kept breaking, but his eyes, oddly, never once looked away. Ostrander wasn't sure at first. If you do this job long enough, she said later in an interview, you learn you can never predict what a cornered person will do. Maybe Nathan really did commit this killing out of desperation, and couldn't even admit it to me. Or maybe he really was innocent. Both were possible. Even Nathan's own account wasn't complete. He'd been in shock. A man who'd never been exposed to violence before, who'd never even held a gun. I don't remember exactly how it happened, he said once, through tears. I just heard a sound, and then Adam was on the ground. That wasn't going to hold up well in court, because vagueness in a courtroom always reads as doubt. In the end, only one thing remained, the physical evidence in the file. 2 men accusing each other, neither account clear enough on its own. Ostrander spread the file across her desk and started over, this time looking not at the stories, but at the numbers, the angles, and the plain rules of physics inside a car. By its 3rd week, the trial had started showing up in local news, headlines like used car dealer charged with murder in loan shark dispute. The story had a certain ring to it. Money, debt, a gun, the desert. A reporter held out a microphone to Lisa Carver on her way out of the courthouse. Lisa just said, "My husband is innocent," and kept walking. In truth, there was a wide gap between the story the media cared about and what the family was actually living through. Nathan's son struggled with the way classmates looked at him at school. The shop stayed closed for 3 months because Nathan was locked up and no one else could run it alone. Lisa spent her own savings just to keep up with the mortgage. Some former customers sent Nathan messages of support. Others turned their heads away when passing the shop. One customer posted online, "There's no smoke without fire." Nathan's attorney actually considered adding that comment to the case file, just to show how quickly the public had rushed to judge. But in the middle of all that noise, the true center of the case never changed. A bullet, a window, a casing. What social media thought wasn't going to change what the court decided, or at least that's how it was supposed to work. One evening, as Lisa told her son that everything was going to be fine, She wasn't entirely sure how convincing her own voice sounded. The boy just nodded, then went to his room. Some nights, that's the only thing a family can do, try to believe in each other, even without proof. Dr. Owen Pratt, the forensic ballistics expert, took the stand with a diagram board. Grey beard, tweed jacket, he looked more like a university professor than anything else. According to the autopsy report, he said, holding his laser pointer to the diagram, the bullet entered the victim's left temple and exited through the right. At first, the room didn't think much of that simple sentence. Ostrander asked, "Dr. Pratt, you're familiar with the seating arrangement in that car, correct?" "Yes," Pratt said. "Mr. Sabo in the driver's seat, the victim in the front passenger seat, the defendant in the back." And, Ostrander continued, if the defendant, from the back seat, had fired at the front passenger, which direction would the bullet have entered and exited? Pratt turned to the diagram. If fired from the back left seat toward the front right seat, the bullet would enter the victim's right temple, the side facing the back of the car, and exit the left. Anyone here play pool? Think of it like the angle a ball comes in on versus where it goes out. In this case, the bullet entered from the exact opposite direction. There was a brief silence. One juror sat tapping a pen against paper, thinking it through. If the bullet had come not from the back seat, but from the driver's seat, from Victor, then the entry and exit direction would match the autopsy report exactly. Nobody said it out loud yet, but everyone was doing the same math, Pratt continued. There's something else. The front windshield. The windshield itself was never broken, fully intact, no cracks. But the side window on the front passenger side, where the victim was sitting, was completely shattered. At first, that detail seemed meaningless in the room, but Pratt patiently kept explaining. If the defendant had fired from the back seat at a diagonal angle, the bullet's natural trajectory would have shattered the windshield, because it would have been traveling forward. But what we have here isn't a forward break, it's a sideways one. That tells us the shot came not from the front of the car, but from the side, from the driver. Finch rose. "Your Honor, this is just a theory," Ostrander answered, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't a theory, Mr. Finch. This is forensic physics. How that glass broke isn't an opinion, it's a fact." Judge Cho overruled the objection. The bullet's direction and the broken glass, two separate pieces of evidence, telling the same story. But Ostrander had more, and the next piece would turn out to be, perhaps, the most striking one of all. A small, empty brass shell casing. Pratt opened a small box. Inside, in a sealed evidence bag, was the shell casing recovered from the scene. "When a semi-automatic pistol fires," he said, "the empty casing ejects to the right of the barrel, at roughly a 90-degree angle. That's a fixed rule of how these weapons are built. There's almost no exception to it." "Now let's think this through," Pratt said. If the defendant, from the back seat, had fired diagonally forward, the casing would have ejected to his own right, toward the middle or front of the car. But if the person in the driver's seat had turned his body to the right to fire at the passenger, where would the casing go? "Backward," Pratt said, "right to where the defendant was sitting." And that's exactly where the casing had been found, in the back seat, right where Nathan had been sitting. The room went completely silent for a moment. One juror leaned slightly forward in her seat. Was this a coincidence, or was it simply the truth? The rules of physics didn't leave much room for coincidence. Finch made one last attempt. "Perhaps the casing shifted after the fact, Your Honor," Pratt answered calmly. "The scene was sealed and photographed by the first responders, Mr. Finch. The casing was in that exact spot in the earliest photographs too." That answer put an end to the objection. Before stepping away from the stand, Ostrander turned to the jury and said something brief. "Physics doesn't lie, people do." That sentence was so simple it might have seemed unremarkable at first, but it would be remembered again and again for the rest of the trial, by the jurors, and later by law students who'd come across this case in their reading. Before Pratt's testimony ended, Ostrander asked one more question. "Dr. Pratt, was a gunshot residue test performed on both individuals arrested at the scene?" Yes, Pratt said. Both of them, about 3 hours after the arrests. And what were the results? Honestly, Pratt said, the 3-hour delay made the result inconclusive. Traces could have been found on both men's hands. One could have fired the weapon, and the other could simply have been inside the car and picked up residue by contact. This test, on its own, doesn't prove who pulled the trigger. The room oddly appreciated that honest admission. An expert acknowledging the limits of his own evidence isn't something you see very often. Finch tried to make use of that. So, Dr. Pratt, this test also doesn't prove your client didn't fire the weapon, does it? That's correct, Pratt said, calmly conceding the point. But the bullet trajectory, the broken glass, the casing position that I described earlier, those are far stronger than any single test. Gunshot residue can be ambiguous. Physics isn't. This was the one genuinely uncertain point in the entire case, and Finch would cling to it tightly, even in his closing. But one ambiguous test couldn't outweigh 3 separate, mutually reinforcing pieces of physical evidence. The room listened on, with dwindling patience, to a witness who kept acting as though he didn't already know that. Judge Cho stepped in at one point, only once, but it landed. Mr. Finch, the witness has already answered the question. Let's move on. That small intervention drew a light ripple of laughter in the room. Even Nathan, for the first time in months, allowed himself a faint smile. The evidence wasn't only physics. Detective Sandra Ruiz, who led the initial response to the scene, took the stand. About 15 minutes after the gunshot, she said, a witness reported seeing Mr. Sabo at a gas station across from the scene, washing his hands in the restroom. That detail drew an odd reaction in the room. A few people even chuckled, then caught themselves and turned serious again. Ruiz continued. Typically, when someone's friend or relative gets shot, the first instinct is to call for help, try to stop the bleeding. Hands get dirty, sure, but people don't think about that in the moment. Mr. Sabo prioritizing washing his hands right after the incident doesn't really fit the ordinary course of human behavior. Ruiz continued. After washing his hands, Victor had called a friend and asked him to bring his wife and 3 kids to that same gas station. To see them, he'd told his friend. He hadn't called an ambulance, hadn't called the police, hadn't gone back to the scene. Instead, he'd gathered his family and gone to a relative's house. Victor would later state, in his own testimony, that he'd panicked out of fear of being killed himself. But Ruiz left a simple question hanging against that excuse in court. If you're genuinely afraid, wouldn't you take your family somewhere safe first? A police station, a hospital? Instead of calling them to a gas station with blood still on your hands. When Ostrander called Victor back to the stand, the direction of her questions had changed, no longer about the gun, but about families. Mr. Sabo, does my client know your family? No, Victor said. Do you live near each other? No, we don't live close. And, Ostrander said, does Adam's family know where you live? Yes, Victor said, with some hesitation. Are you close relatives? Yes. And do you live near each other? Victor didn't answer for a moment. Yes, he finally said, his voice a bit quieter now. Ostrander continued without raising her voice. So, Mr. Sabo, if my client doesn't even know where your family lives, how could he possibly pose a threat to them? But Adam's family knows exactly where you live, don't they? When a relative of theirs dies, whose door do you think they knock on first? Victor didn't answer. But he didn't need to. The question already carried its own answer. Washing his hands, gathering his family, going to a relative's house instead of his own, all of it carried the same fear, the fear of Adam's own relatives coming to collect a debt of their own. It was almost like a silent confession, undoing his own story. Someone in the jury seats gave a small cough. The air conditioning kept up its usual rattle. Somewhere outside, a phone rang, then stopped. Life, even inside a courtroom, has a strange way of holding on to its ordinariness, even while a large truth is coming apart at the seams. Ostrander turned to Victor for one final question. Mr. Sabo, if you suspected my client might be dangerous, even armed, why did you seat him directly behind you, in your own blind spot? Does a reasonable person put someone they consider dangerous somewhere they can't see them? Victor couldn't find an answer to that. There was a long silence, long enough that Judge Cho had to gently remind the witness to respond. Victor finally said, "I don't know," his voice, for the first time, sounding genuinely uncertain. The answer was there, really, just never spoken aloud. Victor had been able to seat Nathan behind him because he was confident. The gun was his. The control was his. He had nothing to fear from anyone, because the dangerous one in that car wasn't the third man, it was him. At this point, Prosecutor Finch scribbled something in his file and shifted a little in his chair. The room had noticed by now which way the evidence was leaning, but the trial wasn't over yet. Closing arguments still lay ahead. As Ostrander walked back from the stand to her table, she gave Nathan a brief glance, not a reassuring one, just one that said, "Hold on." Nathan nodded, slightly. His wife, in the back, gripped her rosary beads a little tighter. No one had relaxed yet, but something in the air of the room had shifted, however faintly. Frank Bellamy, Nathan's sales associate of 10 years, took the stand. He hadn't worn a suit, clearly hadn't borrowed one either, just his best shirt. "Nathan's a good boss," he said, his voice a little shaky. "In the 10 years I've known him, I never once saw him raise a hand to anyone. Even when he got angry, he'd just go quiet." In cross-examination, Finch asked, "Mr. Bellamy, you're loyal to your boss, aren't you? You're here to defend him." Bellamy shrugged. "I'm here to say what I saw, Mr. Finch. Loyalty's a different thing. I'm just saying I never saw this man hold a gun, because I never did." Bellamy shared a memory. One day, when Victor showed up at the shop, Nathan had gone to the back room and hadn't come out for 10 minutes. When I asked him about it, he said he was fine, but his hands were shaking. He couldn't even hold his coffee cup steady. That's not what a guilty man looks like, Mr. Finch. That's what a scared man looks like. This testimony wasn't, on its own, going to win the case. Just a small piece, one more brushstroke added to a portrait of a person. But Ostrander would bring this detail back up in her closing. A frightened man is usually the one who runs, not the one who attacks. In his closing argument, Finch didn't quite recover his earlier confidence. "Your Honor," he said, "this case presents 2 different accounts, and the jury must decide which one to believe." It was a far cry from the sharp tone he'd opened with. He was on the defensive now, not the attack. Ostrander never once raised her voice. "This case isn't a choice between 2 stories, she said. "Physics doesn't tell a story, it tells the truth. Where the bullet entered, how the glass broke, where the casing landed, all of it points in the same direction. And that direction isn't from the seat my client was sitting in." Judge Cho gave the jury their instructions, brief, technical, no embellishment. "Weigh the evidence, independent of emotion," she said. The jury retired. The room emptied out, but Nathan, still at the defense table, kept turning his ring, maybe a little faster this time. The jury came back 2 days later. For those 2 days, Nathan didn't sleep in his cell. His wife ordered the same cold cup of coffee 3 times at the courthouse cafeteria, never finishing any of them. The waiting is always the same, really, ordinary, tedious, and unbearably long. At the end of the second night, a guard brought Nathan an extra blanket in his cell. Probably against the rules, but nobody noticed, or noticed and let it go. "This kind of thing takes a while sometimes," the guard said, without explaining anything further. "Try to get some sleep." Nathan still couldn't sleep, but he remembered that blanket, even years later. The jury foreperson stood. "On the charge of second-degree murder," she said, "the jury finds the defendant not guilty." That was it. No long speech, no dramatic pause, just one sentence, and a man's life changed. Nathan's legs actually gave out from under him, literally. He nearly collapsed into his chair, then started crying, quietly at first, then in full sobs. Ostrander put a hand on his shoulder. Nobody said anything for a while. There wasn't really anything to say. Ostrander would later describe it in an interview. If a man takes a verdict calmly, he could be innocent, or he could be guilty. But if a man's knees give out and he breaks down crying after the verdict, that man really didn't commit the crime. Seeing him like that, I felt something ease in me too. It was professional satisfaction, not just a win. On the other side of the room, Victor Sabo said nothing. He just sat there, frozen. Maybe he still believed no one would ever accept that he'd killed his own cousin. Or maybe, by now, he'd realized that no one would. Judge Cho brought down her gavel, closed the session, and everyone stood. For the last time, reporters rushed straight outside to file the story on their phones. A security guard, holding the door, let out a yawn. This was maybe his 10th case of the day. Justice sometimes ends just like that. A yawn, a door, a staircase. Stories like this usually don't end here, but the movie version does, because the rest just moves forward on paper. In a separate proceeding, Victor Sabo was tried for murder with probable intent and sentenced to 16 years in prison for the death of his own cousin. Nathan went back to his shop. Business isn't quite what it used to be. 3 months in custody and the shadow of a trial don't do a business any favors. But the shop's still open. His son works alongside him now, on weekends. Sometimes, without saying anything, they just wash cars side by side. Ostrander now describes this case as one of the turning points of her career, though without much drama in the telling. "It's not like the movies," she says. "Nobody showed up at my door to threaten me. But you notice, the tougher you get, the more nervous the other side gets. Fear runs both ways." A law student once asked her how she'd won this case. Instead of a long answer, Ostrander just said, "I didn't win it. I just looked where nobody else was looking." Sometimes that's all this job is. The student may not have found that answer satisfying enough, but Ostrander didn't feel the need to add anything more. Maybe there's a lesson in this story, maybe there isn't. But one thing's certain, nobody ever thinks about where a shell casing lands, until, one day, a lawyer has to. And sometimes, that exact small detail is the thing that saves a person's life. Nathan still sits, every now and then, in the old leather chair out front of the shop, watching the cars go by. A customer once asked him if it felt strange, going back to selling cars after everything that happened. Nathan just smiled. "The cars never did anything to me," he said. "The problem was never really the cars anyway.